Thank you. Sorry I'm late.
No worries.
Okay, well, I'd like to call the June 20th meeting of the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District. I'm sorry, just a caveat, I'm also on the Urban Forestry Board for Gresham, but I'd like to call the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District Board meeting to order. Wendy, can we do the roll call?
Yes, Steve Fancher.
Here.
Eric Mueller.
Here.
Dave Ritma.
Here.
John Niama indicated he would not be able to make it. Shirley Craddock.
Present.
Lori Stegman is not present. And Gravett and Corky are not available. James Ellison.
Here.
Mary Helen Kincaid. Saw you. I see Mary
Can you hear us?
Helen. And we can't hear you.
Well, I wonder why. I was muted. Sorry.
Tanny Stephenson.
Here.
Eric Molander.
Present.
Janelle Bell. Have not heard anything from Janelle. Ed Washington.
He had said he would be here earlier, but so
Yeah.
something must have come
Bob
up.
Salinger.
Bob just logged in.
Yeah, no, I've been sitting in the waiting room.
Sorry
Thank
about
you,
that,
Bob. We appreciate you being here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 board members, and that is a quorum today. It's one more than a quorum.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Wendy. Before we get started, like Jim said, while it was yesterday, happy Juneteenth to everybody. I also like to thank James for, I want it noted that I had impeccable timing in taking the chair position here and being out of the country for the first meeting. So thank you, James, for chairing the last meeting. Let's move to the consent agenda. The consent agenda includes 5 items. It includes the work session minutes from the 5-4 meeting, the board meeting minutes from 5-16, the April finance report, the contracts issued report, and the executive director's report. These are all included in pages 2 through 21 of the packet that was sent out. Do I have items anybody would like to pull for further discussion?
I move to accept the consent agenda.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor of accepting the consent agenda, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to the audit report now. Janet, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi. I was not really prepared for that. Can you guys see me? The audit report, it is, I think everyone's had a chance to read it, but this was completed by James Marta. He's been doing the audits for the other districts for the last 5 years. As you can tell, there's not a lot to report for 2021. So we just need to have the board approve it, accept it and approve it.
Thank you, Janet. Eric.
Yes, I guess given my background, I have a bias toward this. I'd like to suggest a motion that's a little bit more detailed than just moving to accept. If if I can, I'll see if I can figure out how to put this. Oh, there it is, into the chat. And the reason being is just, ultimately the management's responsible for putting the financials together, but the board's ultimately accountable, responsible for approving the official financial statements. And it's probably a good thing for it to be kind of formalized in our minutes, particularly given what may happen in the future if we get scrutiny in the future and people looking back over the the record. So, and so the motion is to approve the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District's annual financial statements for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2021, and to accept the reports of the independent certified public accountants.
I'll second.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Shirley. We have a motion. We have a second. We're going to move now. All those in favor of approving the fiscal year 2020-2021 audit report, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any
Aye.
opposed? I'm sorry, any opposed? Okay, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Janet.
Just a question, is this a time where you would take roll? I need advice on that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think if there was a desire to have, it should have been a roll call, a vote on something like this. So I would recommend a roll call vote.
Thanks, Hong. Sorry about that. I forgot that we
Yeah.
were doing roll calls for these. And should we do that now? Wendy, can you call roll on this?
Yeah, Steve Fancher,
Aye.
Eric Mueller,
Aye.
Dave Ripma,
Yes.
Shirley Craddock,
Aye.
James Allison,
Aye.
Mary Helen Kincaid,
Aye.
Tanny Stephenson,
Yes.
Eric Molander,
Aye.
Ed Washington,
Aye.
Bob Salinger,
Aye.
10 votes, it's unanimous.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
Mr. Chair, sorry to interrupt you, but my apologies for being late, but I was completely out of power and just able to get back on, so. that's
Thank you
why.
for being here, Ed. Thank you much.
Pleasure.
And Mr. Chair, may I offer one comment?
Please do.
I want to thank Eric Mueller. Actually provided some pretty helpful advice to staff about the audits and in the future, maybe doing a more formal resolution. So thank you for offering that today. And thanks for paying attention and giving us those suggestions. It's much appreciated. And we'll make sure and take that up more effectively next year. So the feedback is really helpful and I want to acknowledge it. Thank you, Eric.
Mr. Chair, I also have a comment.
Go ahead, Hong.
Yeah, so we, with respect to the voting process, I'll just remind the group that you may have a roll call if you'd like, and it's in your discretion, Mr. Chair, to decide that and offer that up. And if there's a consensus for a roll call, you can proceed with that when it's efficient to do so.
Okay. Thanks, Hong. Thanks for the clarification. Let's move on to the budget consideration. Ben, did you have a presentation to go along with this, or are we moving straight into talking about moving it forward?
We
Good
do have
afternoon.
item 4 as well.
Yeah, if it's okay with
I'm
you.
sorry, I completely skipped over item 4. I'm reading the agenda off my phone. I apologize. And before we get into item 4, I'll say that I've worked with Nancy Hendrickson for a very long time, and I can't think of a better person to be appointed by the city of Portland. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Wendy.
And I just emailed the board a screenshot of the Portland City Council's vote on June 15th to designate Nancy Hendrickson as the city's representative to the urban board. And and I believe that Nancy is here to answer any questions you might have.
Nancy, did you want to say anything before we officially vote to pull you onto the board?
And I haven't seen her, so
Oh.
there we go.
Okay, I found the mute button. But I'm not sure if I can find the video button. It's got to be around here somewhere. Well, to not, oh, there we go. Yeah, just to say that I'm really interested in being on the board. I think this is an important time, setting up the new agency for the next 100 years at least. Looking forward to working with you if you vote me on the board.
Thank you, Nancy. Before we move for a motion, is there anything else anybody would like to say?
I would like to just add to praises to Nancy and her works in environment. She's worked in my neighborhood with BES projects and been very supportive, knowledgeable. I think she's a wonderful addition. And when someone said you had shoes to fill, Mike Jordan's, I think you're going to do them fine. You might even fill them even better. So, and I'll tell Mike that. But thank you for agreeing to do this, because I had advocated that Mike approach you to do this, but I think he had it in his mind already. So I really appreciate you joining the board.
Thanks, Mary Helen. James?
I'll just add that I've worked with Nancy for 20 years, and I think one thing I want this board to know is that behind the scenes at the City of Portland, Nancy's been a driving force to bring together many bureaus on a monthly basis so that the projects that come out of the levy modernization project, the PMLS, that the City of Portland is able to keep pace with what the Corps of Engineers wants to do. That will help all of the people who live and work in the managed floodplain, and will just help streamline what we're doing. I can't thank Nancy enough to be for having the foresight to be bringing the various city agencies together in a proactive way. So very knowledgeable, very competent, very proactive, and I think really has the interest, the broad array of interests in what this new agencies will need to do. I think Nancy has an understanding of those things and a great commitment to the work.
And I'll just say process-wise, after a vote, Nancy will sign an oath of office, and then she will be officially on the board.
Thanks, Wendy. Anybody else? Okay, do I have a motion to appoint Nancy Hendrickson to board position A, which is one director representing the City of Portland, appointed by the Portland City Council?
I'll move.
Mr. Chair, I move to appoint Nancy Hendrickson to board position A, one director representing the City of Portland, appointed by the Portland City Council.
Second.
Thank you. I heard both Bob and Eric there, but we'll take Eric and was that Bob for you for a second?
That'll work.
We have a motion, we have seconds. All those in favor, please. Oh, sorry, roll call. Wendy, go for it.
Steve Fancher.
Aye.
Eric Mueller.
Aye.
Dave Ritma.
Yes.
Shirley Craddock.
Aye.
James Allison.
Aye.
Mary Helen Kincaid.
Aye.
Tanny Stephenson.
Aye.
Eric Molander.
Aye.
Ed Washington.
Aye.
Bob Salinger.
Aye.
Unanimous. Motion passes.
Excellent. Thank you all. Welcome aboard, Nancy, as soon as you sign. Okay, now we can move on to the budget. Ben?
Good afternoon, Chair Fancher, Board of Directors. Wendy, if you wouldn't mind giving me permission to share my screen.
You now have it.
Thank you. Would appreciate it. First of all, I would like to say congratulations to the board. After our budget hearing with the TSCC, Multnomah County Tax Supervising and Conservation Commission, last Monday, they promptly sent this letter to the board, congratulating the board on a successful certification of the budget. The board has approved the budget and it has been certified by the TSCC. Our next order of business is to adopt the budget, and I will show you what that looks like momentarily. This budget adoption is slightly different from the other districts. If you are involved in the other districts, there is no assessment currently
involved in the adoption of the budget. However, we do adopt appropriations into categories. And so our largest category of appropriation is materials and services at $1.8 million. And this is the resolution for your review. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Do we have any questions from the group?
Hey, Ben, I was just curious, are you going to talk about Schedule A at all? Is this the right place to do it, or is it?
We can talk about Schedule A. I think this is a great place to talk about it. And I will scroll down to Schedule A. We have two categories of appropriation, materials and services and contingency. Happy to answer any questions.
I just had two questions, and I don't want to get us high centered on this too much, but I'm just curious, how do you come up with the ranges? I mean, because, for example, the executive director range is up to $500,000 if you look at that range. And then I was also curious about the overhead, which also struck me as very high in this. I know that when you apply for grants with public entities, if you come above 10 or 15% in overhead, you don't even get through the door. I see public agencies consistently charging, 20, 30+% for overhead. And so I just was wondering if you could explain, one, the range on those numbers, and then two, the overhead piece.
Could you also, you said you'd scroll down and I can't, I only
And we're
have
still
one.
seeing the TSCC letter.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Let me try to switch that.
Ben uses lots of screens.
I do.
Well,
I do.
I only have one screen, so I
Oh,
either
thank
have
you.
If
to-
you stop sharing and then reshare, then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting us know.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And Bob, I think you have a great question.
But-
Unfortunately, your question is not related to my to this action, to this discussion. And so I guess I'd like to defer your questions to Keith, our interim CFO. And are you seeing my screen now with attachment A
Yeah.
to the resolution
Yeah.
We are.
2022-0601? So specifically for the budget, I guess I would like to focus our conversation and questions related to this Exhibit A, related to this resolution, just these two categories for appropriation for the urban district budget. However, I think we can get to your questions, Bob, later on in the meeting, if that's all right.
Okay, sure.
Is there, okay, I'm sorry, this is because of my deficiency of technical devices, but is there a detail of what material and services are, like items, or, okay, so it's just me trying to find that document. And that was in our meeting packet?
It is in your meeting packet, and there is
Okay.
a detail, a line item detail of what this $1.8 million makes up.
Okay, I'll try and
And-
find that. Thank
and
you.
So,
If the
Mary
board
Helen,
wishes.
yeah, you may recall that the board has already approved the budget, then it
No,
got
I
sent.
understand that. I'm trying to get a reference in my head. I don't remember all those numbers, and so I couldn't
We-
reasonably answer if it's out of line or in line or any of those things right now. It didn't seem to bother me before, but because of Bob's question, I would like to be able to reference it. So at
Yeah,
some
so
point,
that-
Email is on page 65.
okay,
So there's been no changes to the budget you approved, except that it's been certified by the TSCC, and now you are able to adopt it.
And this would be the final action to adopt the budget.
And I do think it's worth trying to answer Bob's questions.
And I see what I did. I was thinking that was part of this part of it, but it's part of the next section. Okay.
Shirley?
I'll move to adopt the fiscal year 2022, 2023 budget and make appropriations. That's resolution number 2022-06-01.
Thank you for the motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Bob, for the second. So we have a motion, we have a second. Can we go through the roll call, Wendy?
Yes, Steve Fancher,
Aye.
Eric Mueller,
Aye.
Dave Ripma,
Yes.
Shirley Craddock,
Aye.
James Allison,
Aye.
Mary Helen Kincaid,
Aye.
Tanny Stephenson,
Aye.
Eric Molander,
Aye.
Ed Washington,
Aye.
Bob Salinger.
Aye.
Motion is unanimous and it's adopted.
Thank you, everyone. We are going to move now to item number 6, which is the IGA amendment for billing rates, and Keith Hobson. Keith?
Thank you. Keith Hobson, interim CFO. And the requested action today mirrors the annual process of updating the intergovernmental agreements between MCDD and the other drainage districts. Excuse me. These annual amendments update the staff and equipment rates for work billed from MCDD to the other districts. At the format meeting last week, the MCDD board approved a resolution updating the staff billing rates, including the updated overhead rate, and updating the equipment billing rates. This resolution also approved by MCDD board also approved IGA amendments to reflect the updated rates. At the same meeting, all the drainage districts approved corresponding resolutions approving the IGA amendments. So the resolution before you today is the final piece of the year-end adjustments. This resolution will approve the amendment to the service IGA with MCDD to update staff and equipment billing rates. You may recall that several months ago, you also approved an amendment allowing MCDD to directly allocate the costs of certain staff to the urban district. The proposed IGA does not change that, and the staff and percentages approved several months ago won't change. These rates are simply for the other staff who are not being directly allocated and are being billed based on the hourly rate. So I will ask for questions, but I think there was already a question raised, so I'll try and answer that one before I move on to any other questions. In Schedule A, the ranges for the hourly labor rates, they're really to reflect it's by position or positions if it's multiple positions listed. And the range is established to capture the high and low ranges of the positions, but it's also established to try and capture, because we're looking at the total cost of these positions, to try and capture the high and low rates for benefit costs. So for instance, somebody on employee-only medical might be at a lower cost than a person with full family medical. So we've tried to capture these ranges to ensure we've bracketed the high and low end that anybody in this particular salary range could possibly be. The amounts we actually bill are based on the actual cost for an employee, including their actual benefit costs. The other factor is overhead. We had a fairly robust discussion with the MCDD board about the calculation of overhead. One of the changes we've made this year is to include some staff that we believe are really overhead in nature. For instance, they manage the human resources function, they manage payroll, or they manage procurement. And it's difficult to assign them to individual activities of these other districts. So we've included them in the overhead pool, and therefore that caused the total overhead cost to go up a little bit. It's being partially offset by those staff who will no longer be billing directly to the districts anymore. So that question came up at the format as well. So I think that answered the questions that were raised. I don't know if I fully answered them, but I'd also be happy to answer any other questions on this.
Keith, I have a quick question. I think it's related. Maybe you can explain a little bit about the comparables used when salaries are set for district positions.
That's a fairly involved question because we're in the middle of a pay equity study right now. So that will be part of the outcome on here, is looking at internal equity and external equity and reviewing the ranges here, because under the Oregon's pay equity law, we have to ensure that staff doing like work are paid like amounts, but we also ensure that our pay ranges are set competitively in the market, but also consistent with the compensation philosophy of MCDD. That's
just to
kind of
elaborate,
vague, but
yeah,
it's really where we're at, I think. Jim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
we're using a outside firm to help us with the pay study. They work with 2 additional national firms who do comparables. And then they supplemented that with some outreach to local agencies, primarily the City of Portland Metro and the Port of Portland, who are prime competitors of ours for employees. The work remains incomplete, and we got some additional feedback from our management and executive teams to look at a few additional classifications in the local market. That work is underway. We expect to get full recommendations from the outside consultant later this month or early July. And then we'll be looking at all of our pay scales and other things as a result. I would tend to believe personally that our pay scales are too large and we need to narrow them down. The good news is the initial look at our pay scales based on the national consultant works and our local initial work is that our pay scales are broadly in line with our competing agencies in the market, but there may be a few changes we need to make. That's the initial take. The recommendations again aren't final. Happy to answer additional questions.
Thanks, Jim. I saw Bob's hand up first and then Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I would just a comment. I think the pay scales are really large. I mean, we're up to $500,000 on the ED position, which seems, and I understand that we're using the actuals, which makes me feel better, but that's still a pretty massive pay scale. More importantly, right, for the purposes of this conversation, I just want to flag this as a potential equity issue as well. As I said, as somebody who works for a nonprofit, I work with municipalities a lot. I apply for grants a lot, and I'm always struck how unreceptive agencies are to overhead in nonprofits when they're hiring them. Oftentimes, if you're above 10%, you're not going to get through the gauntlet. Sometimes it's even lower than that. So when I see agencies taking this kind of overhead to support themselves, I think there's a lesson there that we need to transcribe to how we work with partners, especially underserved communities, in terms of how we ask them to come to the table and work with us, because the reality is most of those organizations don't pay retirement, don't pay good health benefits, don't do a lot of that kind of stuff, exactly because the organizations like ours aren't necessarily willing to pay for that kind of thing. So I just want to keep that in people's mind, because I think it's a big equity issue that often gets lost in contracting.
I do want to, before we go to additional questions, I want to make one clarification on the hourly labor rates. These are not the actual amounts being earned by the employees. These hourly labor rates include multiple factors, including the actual pay scale, as well as full cost of the benefits, also overhead, plus it also includes a factor to account for leave time, so that this would be the true billable cost for all costs related to that, but it's not the pay scale alone. So I just want to make sure that's understood.
Yes, thank you.
Eric?
Am I unmuted? Okay, yeah, I just was wondering if Keith could speak a little bit to the change in the equipment rates, what's driving some of those cost increases. You know, some of them may not have been at the right level the year before, but some of the jumps seem a bit larger than I might have expected.
I think in the case of equipment, some of it is actual, we are seeing inflation in the cost of equipment, including rental rates. The other big factor driving it is many of the equipment rates also include the cost of fuel. And given the cost of increase in gasoline and diesel, that's causing a significant increase in this area as well.
Mary Helen?
I just wanted to support what Bob said about administrative rates, and the 10% seems to be pretty much the regular. I'm on a board investigating those kinds of things for the state, and it is a real equity issue, especially in people seeking foundation grants as well as state grants. And the state has a litany of regulations because they spend taxpayer dollars of what can be spent on what, and they are looking at those regulations because many nonprofits are circumventing that by calling administrative costs something else. And so I think we need to be very cognizant of how we look as a agency when we serve nonprofits and have large administrative costs, because those can be examined at some point. But I really support Bob's idea to discuss this next year. I brought this up in sort of a different fashion, and I think it's important that we have a presence or public appearance that we're spending people's money wisely. And with large overhead administrative costs, some people may question that who deal with nonprofits like Bob and I do. So just kind of wanted to add that into next year's or the upcoming year's discussion about budgets.
Mary Helen. Other questions, comments? Not for this year, but for future years, I might suggest that you look at possibly broadening a little bit the comps used. I know that when we do comps for employee salaries, we look at about 10 different local municipalities and board or districts. But I know as a district, this is different than strictly a municipality. But you know, obviously those are the Port of Portland, City of Portland are some of the highest, Metro, some of the higher in the region. And as we've got East County cities on the board, you might look at pulling some of those into the comps. Just a suggestion, but I know you're looking at your most competitive agencies for pulling employees, and so understand kind of why you've selected what you have. Just for future consideration, may want to look at broadening a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I want to stress that 2 national companies did a broader search that went well beyond those. And it was based on feedback from our executive team to look at the additional ones. So it's just a handful of classifications, engineers, some finance folks. So again, took a pretty broad look and then tried to make sure it was localized with those at the tip of the spear, as it were.
Thanks. Do we have a motion?
I thought we already had one.
I don't have a motion yet for amendment of the billing rates.
Oh, my apologies. Then I'll be happy to move a motion to adopt the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District Resolution 2022-0602, approving amendment number 2 to the intergovernmental agreement between MCDD and the district for administrative support.
Thank you, Eric. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Tanny. So we have a motion by Eric, second by Tanny. Let's go through roll call.
Thank you. Steve Fancher,
Aye.
Eric Mueller,
Aye.
Dave Ripma,
Yes.
Shirley Craddock,
Aye.
James Allison,
Aye.
Mary Helen Kincaid,
Aye.
Tanny Stephenson,
Aye.
Eric Molander,
Aye.
Ed Washington,
Aye.
Bob Salinger.
But I do want to be on record just being with those concerns. I want to make sure they make it into the notes.
Noted.
Thank you.
Motion's unanimous. It passes.
Thank you. We are going to move item 7, Jim's discussion of the equity framework, to a subsequent meeting in the interest of time, and move directly to the polling update. Is that still correct, Jim? Should we?
I can be brief. Let me just be brief. I want to give credit to Ontiveros. They completed their mission of incorporating your recommendations into the framework document. They sent the proposed changes based on your feedback that, again, we didn't hear it, so we asked them to do it. They sent it to me just as I was leaving on vacation Thursday afternoon and all day Friday. And my last several days have involved many hours of riding a bicycle in which I was unable to read the revisions to the framework. So staff will be evaluating those over the next day or two. We will send you the proposed draft framework in its entirety later this week. And then we will pick it up at your regular July meeting, which is in the third week of July, because we have a strategy session with you and Willette Capers on your July 8th meeting. So you should receive it here in the next few days, and that will give you plenty of time to review it. You could probably ask some questions at the July 8th meeting if you like, and then we'll have more time to discuss it at your regular July meeting. And my regrets for not getting that out to you, but I felt like it was important for me to go over it and make sure we were all set. So the delay is on me, not on anyone else, and I regret that and look forward to getting it out to you shortly.
Thank you, Jim. Any questions before we move on to the polling update? Hearing none. Evan, it's you're up.
Hi, folks. I am just checking to see if our pollster has logged on yet. And
we're ahead of schedule. Oh my God.
We're quite ahead of schedule. So I am going to recommend, so I don't see him and he's not responding to my texts, that perhaps if
coming on
he's
here.
now,
He's here.
Yay, yay. Okay, great. Well, so our pollster, Dave Metz with FM3 is logging on right now. Hi, Dave. Thanks for joining us. And at our last board meeting, you all may recall that we reviewed a draft of a poll that we were going to put out into the field with all of you. That poll went out into the field and was out earlier this month. And Dave just shared the results with me late last week, and now we're sharing them with you all. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave to give you all some insight into what we heard. Thank you, Dave.
All right, thank you very much, Evan. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today and to share the results of our recently completed survey on local voter perceptions of flood risks and their willingness to support enhanced funding to improve flood controls in the region, as well as exploring a variety of messaging and sort of communications themes that might be used to engage the public in more of a conversation about flood risks and what needs to be done about them. I will say, just by way of sort of introduction, that the survey is by and large good news. It shows that there is broad support in principle for making additional investments to support flood control improvements. It also shows that when we specifically ask voters if they would be willing to pay more in taxes each year, the answer comes back yes. Voters clearly understand that these are meaningful risks that are likely to increase over time and that it's worth making an investment to protect against them today. At the same time, the survey also shows that flood risks are among the items about which voters in the region are least concerned right now. Even if we set aside issues like homelessness, the cost of living, things that are everyday front of mind concerns, and just limit our focus to issues like natural disasters, flood risks are among the things that people perceive as being the least compelling, the least likely to be challenging them in the near term, despite the fact that most Multnomah County residents remember significant flooding in the region in the past. All of this, I think, highlights the nature of the communications challenge that is facing us. We have to make sure voters understand just how real and how significant those risks are, and reinforce their instinct to be willing to provide funding to support flood protection with a sense of urgency that suggests that even at a time when there's lots of other issues that are commanding voters' attention and investments of tax dollars, that this is one of the things that is most important for them to focus on. The good news is the survey, I think, shows us a wide range of messaging, which is very helpful in making that case. And again, reinforcing voters' initial instinct that this work is worthwhile. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive into some of the key findings of the survey. First, just a little bit about our methodology. We conducted the interviews between the 3rd and 10th of this month. So as Evan said, this is very fresh data. We've just been out of the field for 10 days at this point. We interviewed 660 voters across the region. We included an oversample of voters of color, which gave us 120 total within that overall sample. That brings our margin of error for those voters of color under 9%, which is a much more robust sample than we would typically find if we just did a normal random voter sample survey within the region. And that allows us to speak with more confidence to some of the distinctions between the views of communities of color and the community at large. The interviews were done using a mixed mode methodology. We interviewed people on landline phones, wireless phones, and with an online survey to which participants were invited to respond via both email and text invitations, which is sort of the standard methodology that we use these days. So what did we learn? To start with, we asked respondents to indicate whether they had a favorable or unfavorable view of a variety of different organizations and entities that are active within the region. Many of these are ones that either would have roles in administering flood controls or would be impacted by flooding in the region. And you'll see the responses that we got here overall. In general, we saw favorable perceptions of PDX overwhelmingly, 93% favorable, including half of local voters who view them very favorably. Positive perceptions of Metro, of the respondent's own city, of the Port of Portland, although there is quite a few voters who don't know enough about the port to offer an evaluation. And then almost total lack of knowledge of local drainage districts. As you'll see, 21% say that they have a positive view of their local drainage district, 8% unfavorable, but the majority, about 7 in 10 local voters, say they simply don't know enough to offer an opinion. Perhaps not surprising, but still helpful to quantify here. We also offered the respondents a list of issues facing Multnomah County and asked them to rate each one in terms of its seriousness as either an extremely, very, somewhat, or not a serious problem. And we limited our focus here largely to issues that are ones that the work of this district would address. We've done a lot of other polling in the region recently to know what sort of the top tier concerns on voters' minds are. And it's worth noting here that climate change ranks as a pretty broad and intense concern for voters within the district. 73% rate it as an extremely or very serious problem, including more than 2 in 5 who rate it as an extremely serious problem. So that is both a notably broad and strong degree of concern that voters are expressing on that issue. Also, significant concerns about water quality, pollution of rivers, streams, and the sloughs. Almost 2/3 rate that a very serious problem. And then we have more than 3 in 5 that say the same for loss of fish and wildlife habitat, deteriorating streets and roads, and then inefficiency in local government. That is something that's important to remember right now. There is a fair amount of cynicism about government at all levels within the greater Portland region, somewhat less in Multnomah County than in other areas. But that is also something that is still on voters' minds. It's when we look at the very bottom of the slide, though, that we start to see the lack of urgency that voters see around flood risks. Severe rainstorms, fewer than 1 in 5 rate that a very serious problem. And when we talk about the risk of flooding, either from the Willamette or Columbia rivers, it is only just over 1 in 10 that rate those as very serious problems, with nearly half of voters saying it simply is not a serious problem. We anticipated this and had some questions designed to dig a little bit deeper on perceived risks of flooding. One of those questions asked people to consider the risks the region may face from man-made and natural events, and had them rate the level of risk they perceive to themselves on a 10-point scale from each of these items. So you'll see the average score on the 10-point scale running down the right-hand side. The dark red bars on the right are the proportion that perceive an extremely high risk to themselves. The sort of salmon colored bars are the proportion that rated it a 6 to 9. So on the high risk side of the scale. And then the blues are the proportion that are really viewing only a relatively moderate level of risk. You will note that flooding stands out at the very bottom as the item about which they see the least risk. It is the only one, in fact, where the average score is under 5 on this 10-point scale. It's exceeded by wildfires, extreme heat events, drought, even earthquakes, seen as a bigger risk. It is worth noting, and this is something that's important to come back to when we look at messaging in a few moments, that climate change-driven extreme weather events are the item that are at the top of the list. And obviously, it is exactly those kinds of events that could yield flood risks in the region. And so that connection is something that's important to remember. Even if voters don't see flooding as a risk, they recognize that climate change is heightening the danger of a variety of challenges that in regular times might not seem to them to be as severe. Now, at the same time, it's not as if local voters don't have some recollection that, yes, there can be flooding in this region. In fact, a 59% majority of the people that we polled told us that they themselves recalled serious flooding in Multnomah County. It is notable, however, that that skewed much more toward older voters and longer-term residents of the area. Almost 3/4 of those aged 65 and over recall serious flooding, but that recall was much less pronounced among younger residents and more recent arrivals to the county. Now, anticipating that people's perceptions of risk might be low, we knew we needed to explore ways that we could articulate the problems that might occur when flooding might take place. And so we offered the respondents a list of things that might happen if a major flood of the Columbia happened because of a rain event that caused a levee or pump station to fail, and asked people to rate their level of concern about each of these potential outcomes. Again, we used a 4-point scale of either extremely, very, somewhat, or not concerned, and we've ranked them here by the proportion on the top 2 points on that scale that said they were either extremely or very concerned about each item. So the 5 items that you see at the top of the slide really stand out in terms of the intensity of the responses we got back, with about half of all voters telling extremely concerned about risks. And these are things that are basic risks to human life, health, and safety. In particular, risks to water supplies, from water treatment facilities flooding, the potential that flooding could wash industrial chemicals and other hazardous materials into the river, that people could be injured or die, and that thousands of residents could be displaced from their homes. You'll see here we have a number of different ways that we're describing the same potential underlying risk. We're just looking for different ways, see whether there's differences in the way people react to different ways of describing some of these same concepts. But anything that is a core threat to human life and safety, particularly as it affects drinking water, those are items that are at the top of people's lists. The notion that electricity substations could be flooded, you'll see that one second from the bottom. Less intensity there, but still relatively broad concern. And then here we have a middle tier of concerns. These are all items that at least half of voters indicated would make them very concerned. But you'll note that those dark red bars really have dropped off here relative to what we saw on the first slide. So these are all items where the real sort of urgency of concern is significantly lower. It's no more than about 1/4 of those polled. And here we're talking about disruptions to the economy to a large degree. 60,000 jobs being lost, half the region's manufacturing jobs, notion that major freeways could be flooded and closed to traffic, and then impacts on delivery of food products to grocery stores and first responder facilities being cut off and unable to respond. Those also ranked in this middle tier of concerns. And then finally, you'll see the items here about which voters expressed the least concern. These are all ones that less than half rated as very concerning. Flooding of the airport, light rail lines, disruptions to delivery services or store selling basic supplies. Essentially anything that involves interrupting logistics or transportation, on its face, voters see as less concerning. Obviously, some of these same mechanics are what lead to the economic disruptions and potentially some of the health and safety disruptions that we saw listed on the previous slide. So what this tells us is just that we have to connect those dots. We have to explain why disrupting these transportation networks is actually going to potentially pose significant risks to health and safety as well, as opposed to just them, the disruptions on their own being things that may concern voters. Now we then tested support for a potential bond measure, and obviously the district is exploring a need for both capital and operating funding here. This poll was not designed to be a poll that tested in any kind of thorough or concrete way the feasibility of funding proposals that might be put forward, but we did want to at least get a basic sense of voters' openness to the idea of providing this kind of funding. So We didn't test ballot language or detailed policy proposals, but we did raise the concept of a $175 million bond measure to address some of the major capital projects that will be required to improve flood protection along the Columbia River. We gave voters the description you'll see at the top of the slide, and 66% of those polled indicated that they would support it. 22% said that they would oppose it. That's obviously an encouraging starting point. Anytime you are over 50%, you're in a good place. And anytime you have 3 times as much support as you have opposition, that's also encouraging to see. At the same time, note how much of that support is coming from people who qualify their position by saying they would be somewhat supportive. Fewer than 1/4 indicate that they are offering strong support. And again, I think what that reflects is simply that the risks that the region faces from flooding and the infrastructure that protects the region from floods are relatively unknown and unfamiliar to voters. So while this sounds like a good idea, it's just not something they've given much thought to previously, and they don't have a lot of information to evaluate whether this particular set of investments and the price tag that we've attached to them are really justified. And I think that indicates the need to, again, sort of communicate with the public and make the case for why this is important. It's certainly better to be in a position where you have 66% support and your main goal is to firm up the positive feelings that most voters have, as opposed to being in a place where you start with opposition and have to overcome that in order to be successful. But there still is an educational task before us here. So quickly, here's just a few of the demographic breakouts within the district in terms of the level of support that people offered. We had solid support from both Democrats and independents, 71% of Democrats, 67% of independents, Republicans more ambivalent, 43% in favor, but a 52% majority opposed. Sorting people by ideology, progressive residents of the region, 83% in favor and only 6% against. Solid majorities among both liberal and moderate voters, and even conservative voters by a slim margin of 50 to 41 indicate that they would be in favor. When we look at it by gender and age, the differences here are really very modest. Slightly broader and more intense support among men and among voters under 50, but those differences are relatively small, and there's solid support across all of these demographic groups. And then comparing white voters and voters of color. And again, we oversampled voters of color to be able to speak more specifically to their perspectives. Very comparable levels of support across lines of ethnicity. We also asked people to indicate whether they spoke a language other than English at home. And you'll see more uncertainty among those respondents who said that they did speak a language other than English, perhaps underscoring the importance for multilingual outreach as well. Now, in terms of the kinds of improvements that the district might undertake in order to address the region's flood risk, we had the respondents rate the relative importance of each of these projects from their own perspective, again, using a similar 4-point scale. And I would note the objective here is not to determine from a policy perspective what activities the district should undertake. You all obviously have a thorough assessment of flood risks and you know what improvements need to be done. It's simply a matter of identifying how that knowledge intersects with public perception and the places where the public either doesn't recognize the importance of a set of improvements or places where perhaps their view is already aligned with what, from an engineering perspective, you know is already needed. You'll see the most urgency here when we look at those dark blue bars, rating these projects extremely important, comes for protecting the backup drinking water supply. We saw how important that was to voters as a risk on the earlier slides, and so investing to keep it safe is critical. And then preparing for the impacts of climate change, an issue about which they expressed a great deal of concern at the top of the survey. And clearly the sense of the risks that climate change will pose lead them to want to invest in preparing. We then have a range of other items, sort of basic core infrastructure elements, protecting, having backup power so pumping stations won't fail, protecting the airport, but also some issues relating to the environment, making sure that we're protecting floodplains that provide wildlife habitat and natural flood protection, planting trees to provide shade and help reduce stormwater runoff. Those items really reflect the importance of what are sometimes referred to as natural climate solutions. where we see the public really enthusiastic about the dual benefits that they can provide, both protecting the environment and providing flood protection at the same time. But basic brick and mortar infrastructure also matters to them. The last item on this slide, repairing aging pumps, pipes, and drains, also highly important. Keep in mind that we're starting out with 66% of voters who said they would support a bond measure. Each of these items is well in excess of that in terms of the proportion who indicate they view these projects as very or extremely important. So at least some undecided voters or potential opponents are looking at these projects and saying, yeah, these things are worthwhile and fairly urgent. As we move down the list, you'll see a range of other items that majorities of voters rate as either extremely or very important. I think it is somewhat ironic that the last item you'll see ranked on this list is reducing flood risk itself, which obviously is the core motivation for all of this work. But what voters are essentially saying is being specific about what is at risk and therefore what is being protected makes it resonate a little bit more than just talking about that broad category of flood risk, because as we've seen before from many members of the public, they just don't view it yet as being particularly urgent. Finally, here you'll see the lowest list of priorities. The notion of things like providing information about the cultural history of the area, providing walking, running, and cycling access. These are things that voters are not dismissing or rejecting. Fewer than 1 in 5 view them as unimportant, but they just don't have quite the same level of urgency as the items we've seen on the last several slides, many of which, again, go to core health and safety protections. And then finally, the least compelling item that we tested was acquiring property from willing sellers that frequently floods or is at high risk of flooding. We've done some research on this concept in other communities, and there's a whole lot of complications that go into talking about these programs. Voters want to understand, are these sellers really willing? What are we paying? How much does it cost taxpayers? What's being done with that property once it's acquired? There's obviously a whole lot of complications there that I think lead voters to be a little tentative in their initial reactions to how urgent it is. Now, of course, another critical element here is exactly how much this would cost the public. All of these things take money, and so approving a bond measure and the operating costs that would need to be go alongside it have some cost to them. And so we asked our respondents about 3 potential price points that they might be asked to pay in terms of annual taxes per year. Leaving it kind of vague as to exactly what form those tax increases would take. But as you'll see, even at an amount of $84 per year, we still have 53% of voters telling us they would be willing to support it. 61% would be willing to pay $60 a year, and 70% who would be willing to pay $36 per year. You'll note that that dark blue bar on the left, the proportion who say they're very willing to pay that amount, really does change pretty dramatically as we move through the price points. Although again, we still have a majority that are at least somewhat willing at each of the 3 price points we tested. This is encouraging to see. Obviously, a lot more future work will have to be done around the specific mechanisms and how they're designed and allocated. But it does suggest that the public knows that there's no free lunch here, that it ultimately is going to be their tax dollars that will pay for these flood protections, and they're indicating a reasonable amount of willingness to pay those taxes. Finally, we had a section that explored messaging that might be used in communicating with voters about some of these risks. We retested support for the potential $175 million bond measure after we walked voters through a series of messages. And as you'll see here, while the overall support only went up by 6 points, the messaging was really impactful in addressing that concern I flagged earlier, which was converting that soft support into more firm support. That dark blue bar almost doubles from 23% to 40% after voters hear the messaging. And after the messaging, there are more voters in that strong support category than that soft support category. So that's encouraging to see. It suggests that what's holding voters back is not really resistance to the idea of making these investments. It's probably just a lack of knowledge and understanding about the nature of the risk, the benefits that would be provided, and why this time and approach is the right one to raise the money needed. So here is the list of messages we tested that produced the movement that I showed you on the previous slide. Running down the left-hand side, you'll see the proportion of respondents that rated each of these a very convincing message. And typically with these kinds of questions, we're looking for messages that at least 40% of those polled rate as being a very convincing message. And we have 4 that hit that standard here. One that talks about the pollution risks and the threats to drinking water and surface water supplies that would come from flooding. The basic principle of prevention. And I think this is something that's really important to focus on in a time when we know there's a lot of economic anxiety. The cost of living in the Portland region, which was already high, has gotten even higher with inflation. And that's an understandable source of anxiety for voters. But the need for these protections won't go away. And the longer we wait, the more expensive it will be to put them in place. And certainly it's less expensive to invest in protections now than it would be to deal with the impacts of a major flood event. Voters ultimately understand that, and that's a compelling reason for taking action. The inequities that are inherent in the lack of protections that are currently available, with low-income communities and communities of color facing greater flood risks in the absence of needed protections. That's also a compelling argument for making these investments. And then finally, the notion that the region could be eligible for matching funds, that for every dollar that local taxpayers put up, they're going to make themselves eligible for additional matching funds. That also seems like a smart economic investment at a time when, again, voters may be a little bit more careful with their pocketbooks. Just below that 40% threshold, we have a message which focuses on the link between climate and flood risk, which I mentioned earlier, I think is really important for us. Voters understand that climate change poses a risk. They don't necessarily see a huge problem with flooding, but linking those two and explaining how climate change increases those flood risks can be really important and helpful. And then you'll see as we move through the messages, there's 2 more that are in the 30s, just below that 40% focus chain. You'll see that when we talked about the disruption of roads and highways and delivery services, voters kind of shrugged in the earlier questions. But connecting the dots and basically talking about the impact that's going to have on the economy as a whole is impactful. Talking about the benefits for conservation that can come hand in hand with flood control investments. And then finally, 2 of the less compelling arguments were ones that talked about the provisions for preserving and educating the public about cultural history, and then the flood insurance benefits that come from having this flood protection. With relatively few local residents required to pay flood insurance right now, that's not necessarily something that is on voters' minds, although we've seen in other communities, if we make clear that those kinds of requirements could come in the future, avoiding them can still be worthwhile for voters, but again, just not something that most of them are already thinking much about. So here you'll see the overall ranking of those same messages that we just walked through. Again, 4 of them at the 40% threshold or over, 2 of them in the high 30s, and then the rest slightly below that. None of these messages inspires any negative reaction or any backlash. They're all at least somewhat convincing to 3 in 5 voters polled or more. It's just a question of which ones tend to generate the most intense and passionate reaction, and that's really those 4 that we see at the top of the slide. We also did some segmentation analysis and basically looked at a variety of different populations that might be open to changing their minds as they get more information. And we just wanted to check and make sure that the rank ordering of the message is the same with those voters who might change their position as it is with those who are either locked into support or locked into opposition. And the good news is that it is. For those persuadable subgroups, they tend to rank the messages in roughly the same order. And that means if you frame your broad communications around some of those topics, it's going to be resonant both with those who are already inclined to be supportive as well as those who are on the fence and potentially would benefit from more education. Finally, anytime you're communicating a message, it is almost as important, sometimes perhaps more important, that you choose the right messenger, someone who is going to be credible and trusted as they're delivering the information, as it is to choose the right message for them to deliver. And so we tested a variety of different people and organizations that might communicate with the public about flood risks and the steps needed to address them. We asked the respondents if they would generally trust or be suspicious of information coming from each of these sources. And the dark blue bars on the left are the proportion that rated each one very trustworthy. The light blue is somewhat trustworthy, and then you'll see the total for each side of the ledger running down the right-hand side of the slide. So at the top, scientist, flood safety engineer. Shortly behind them, the Army Corps of Engineers and local conservation groups and nonprofits. All of them are seen as being highly credible on these issues. And that's not uncommon. Essentially, what people are looking to are people who have some scientific or technical expertise that could give them a realistic sense of the risks that we're facing. But organizations that lack any kind of personal stake or profit motive in the responses here aren't coming at this from a perspective of ideology, but simply, a technical evaluation of risks and benefits. And so all of those messengers and those first four there at 70+%, rating them trustworthy. FEMA is just a short step behind. There's a larger group there that expresses some suspicion about what they might say. I think that's true for almost any federal agency these days. The State Office of Emergency Management, your neighbors, and then the Port of Portland. Again, all positive feelings, just a little bit less intense as we move our way down the list. The ones that they tend to be least trusting in are elected officials, businesses that operate in the floodplain, and local government staff. Again, just given some of the widespread cynicism about government, it's regrettable, but not unsurprising. And then attitudes toward elected officials in general, in good times or bad, people tend to view them with a little bit more skepticism. Levy Ready Columbia, the negative reaction, what isn't really a negative reaction there, it's just a collective, I really don't know who they are, I don't have enough ability to evaluate whether they're trustworthy or not. So that shouldn't be seen as that last item as a negative indication, simply just a widespread lack of familiarity. So that takes us to the conclusions that you'll see here. Again, I think there's sort of there's both good news and bad news coming from the survey in sort of equal measure. The most striking findings are first, the low degree of recognition of flood risks that local residents have, the real urgent need to make them understand just how imminent these risks are and the urgency of preparing for them. But the good news is that even in the absence of that awareness, the public still thinks it is worthwhile to make investments in flood protection. The general outline of the kinds of improvements that need to be made and some sense of what it would cost local taxpayers don't seem to give them pause. And we have a broad level of support initially, which becomes more intense and more committed as the public gets more information and is educated. So hopefully this gives you a good starting point to think about how to communicate and sort of make the case to the public about the work that the district is going to do. But moving forward, there's obviously lots more to be done here to figure out how voters would react to the mechanics of the finance mechanisms that might be put before them, and to figure out the best way to assemble the building blocks that this survey tested in terms of messages, messengers, risks and benefits, into a compelling description of the projects that the district will be undertaking. So with that, I'll hand it back to Evan if there's anything you want to add, and then happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I really appreciate you walking through that with folks. I think in terms of next steps, you all recently approved a communications contract that included more public opinion polling and then a set of contractors who are going to help us with our communications and engagement work. And so we're working over the summer to really take these results, figure out our next steps in terms of additional public opinion research, and then also working on our core messaging, working on branding. And so there'll be more, folks will be coming forward with more information to share with you all and proposals to talk about over the next several months. But want to make sure that we get your questions, comments out there. I see a couple of people coming off camera. So maybe an indication of hands, just so that I know the order to call people out on if there's any questions or comments. All right, I didn't see who came up first. I think that Bob.
I think Mary Helen beat me to it.
Okay. Mary Helen, go ahead.
Mary Helen didn't beat him to the unmute part. I have a couple questions about this. I'm kind of excited because I've been talking on the ground to my neighbors, but, and I don't know which ones, and they all pretty much agree with what your findings said, except the part that we live, half the neighborhoods in managed floodplain. And I'm in East Columbia neighborhood. And so their concerns are much higher, and their appreciation for the ability not to have to pay for flood insurance for home mortgages is much higher. And so the realization of that, so I didn't know if there were figures of how many people, because those opinions would look like they would weigh heavily in the questions that you asked. And so I don't know how many would be affected by insurance loss, because somebody in Alameda, if they got asked, but they would be in this district, could probably care less about flood insurance, so doesn't want to pay for it. And so I don't know how the balance was of that. And the other part, and I'll save all the rest for maybe another day, but is if income levels came into play in any of this, because we have two of the lowest income neighborhoods in a Fox Run mobile home park and a Deltawood. And oddly enough, when I talk to the people in the Columbia River RV Park with $200,000 to $1 million RVs, they're all equally concerned because they don't want to bob like corks in the water. But the ability for them to recover is vastly different. So how does that weigh in, or in responses? Because I can see where it would greatly affect if you talk to more people from the Columbia River RV Park than you did from Deltawood, who just figured they'd have to go be homeless.
Yeah. All excellent questions. So I'll try to take them one by one here. The first is, in terms of the impact of flood insurance, we asked our respondents if they currently pay flood insurance, and an enormous number of them said that they did. They don't. And so what that reflects is just some confusion that people have. There's a lot of people who think they are insured against flooding who in fact are not. On the other hand, there are people, as you're pointing out, who are very specifically paying flood insurance, are highly conscious of how much it costs, and would like to get out from under those requirements. That subset, given that this was a district-wide survey, is such a small portion that it's hard to analyze separately. But everything you just described is completely in line with what we've seen in other communities where we've done similar research, which is you can sit down with people who are required to pay flood insurance and walk through the financial cost benefit of voting for these investments. It's really a no-brainer once you lay it out. And so that is an enormously compelling argument for those folks who actually are in that position where they're having to pay flood insurance. No question about it. And then the income correlation overall, we did not see a dramatic one in this poll. I think the amounts that we were asking about were small enough that we didn't see the same kind of resistance that we do if we're potentially talking about larger tax impacts. And again, depending on what mechanism ultimately the district decides upon and how it's applied, understanding those variations, I think, will be important. But when it comes to flood protections, what we've seen from people at large is generally just what you described, which is paying a little bit now to avoid the incredible expense and disruption that could come later, generally is worth it to them. And so we didn't see a huge distinction by income in this poll.
So I'm going to give this lead into Bob, because this supports a lot of what Bob talks about. When I ask people about if they're concerned of what would happen to the fish in the river, and habitat, and they say, what fish? The river's polluted, there are no fish. Quite a few of them will say that because they've lived along the river and in Portland for a long time. So it's, also the realization of the question and the interpretation of people. And many people don't even know that they live within a half mile of a levee that holds the river back. They just think it's a raised road and can't understand why there can't be fences on it. So I guess those perceptions seem to weigh into some of these, but I know you can't avoid them. I just didn't know if they were. So I'll leave it to Bob for the fish story, because I found that quite entertaining. I went to a neighborhood meeting just 3 weeks ago and said, is anybody concerned about the fish habitat in the river? And I'd say, other than about 2 people in the room, said, there aren't any fish in the Columbia River. They're all polluted. And another guy said, well, why are they fishing for them? And he said, because they're crazy. So it's interesting the perceptions that people have about not fearing that it's a problem when it is. So.
So thanks for the presentation. I have a lot of questions for you. I'll just ask two quick ones here and maybe send you a few. One is I'm curious about the perceptions of government, especially at the beginning of your presentation. I've seen other recent polling where government was rated much lower than this one. This one seemed much more optimistic, and it's this feels very different. So I'm curious about that. Number one, and number two, I was wondering if you could tease out green infrastructure a little bit more. That seemed to pop to some degree, trees and other green infrastructure, protections of floodplains. What do you take away from that in terms of messaging, in terms of balancing our messaging between built infrastructure and green infrastructure?
Yeah. So, on the first question, you're absolutely right. We have done lots of other polling for the city, for Metro, where we've asked about attitudes toward local government, and the very specific places and ways that we have asked about it, we've gotten some pretty negative responses. I will say that because we're asking county-wide here, and we didn't specifically ask about Portland city government, that's where we see most of the negative results concentrated. And so I think we're working around the edges of where a lot of that most intense negative sentiment is. But we should all be under no illusion that, right now there is just a pervasive level of distrust of government at all levels, but particularly local government in the region. I think a district like this that's starting out fresh, that has a very focused, singular mission, probably benefits from a little bit more goodwill than city government or county government writ large would. But there's headwinds that we're sailing into here, which, as you point out, we have to be aware of. On the green infrastructure issue, as I say, this has been a pretty consistent finding that we've seen in a lot of polling, that people like the idea that if we are going to build flood protections, that they be built in ways that leverage nature's ability to provide flood protection along the way, help to conserve natural areas and beautify the places that these flood protections are going to be. That seems to be a real, at the same time, understands that not sufficient. Just given that we have a massive urban environment along these rivers, that there are places where they're going to have to be, cement will have to be poured in order to get things done. I wouldn't use the polling data to guide your thinking about the balance between those two approaches. I think you should be guided, obviously, by what the engineers say is the right approach. But it certainly does mean that shining a spotlight on the places where you are able to take advantage of natural infrastructure is really helpful, because the public is likely to greet that with a lot of enthusiasm. And so it ought to be brought to their attention that is something that you're a part of the focus of your work.
James?
Great. Thank you, David. Wonderful presentation. I really appreciate this first look and insight into what constituents are prioritizing. Nice job, Evan, as well. I understand we're early in the process and we will learn more. I do have one question. So about 2 weeks ago, I got a call from someone at Portland Parks and Recreation. They're looking at long-term funding and a potential bond measure in the next 1 to 3 or 4 years. How can board members who represent various jurisdictions help you coordinate amongst regional players who plan to put something on the ballot, just so that we're careful about timing and coordinated about timing? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I will say in general, I think that there is ample record both in the Portland region, statewide in Oregon, and in other parts of the country, where voters are willing to vote for multiple measures that are funding vital public services at the same time. They understand that there's multiple needs for those dollars. And in a region like this that is relatively progressive overall, the anti-tax sentiment that's out there is a relatively minority sentiment. And in particular, I think parks and natural areas are an area where voters really see them as being complementary to a lot of the other sort of built infrastructure that they may be voting So certainly there's, if you look at the history of the natural areas, bonds and levies that Metro has put forward, the measures that Portland Parks have put forward, the record of success in getting approval for those measures has been pretty strong in good economic times and bad, and politically sort of happy and more negative times. So I think it is doable. At the same time, because we are entering an era where cynicism about government is high, where the sense that the cost of living is rising rapidly and many families are struggling, the potential tensions between those things are probably a little bit higher than they would normally be. So I don't think that means we can't have multiple measures passed at the same time, but it does place a premium on exactly the kinds of communications you were describing, which is having the overlapping jurisdictions be in conversation with one another, understanding what your mutual plans are, and then being prepared to, if there are multiple funding measures that are going forward at the same time, being prepared to talk about the ways that they complement one another, and avoiding any situation where voters feel like they have to pick and choose between them. I think that is a particular risk for this district because the perception of flood risk is so low. It may be something where voters can say, we can defer that. We can wait another 2 years. We can wait another 4 years to get to it because I just don't feel like it's a threat that's imminent. So we don't want voters to be in that pick and choose mode. We want them to be able to say, hey, we have multiple urgent priorities and there's a thoughtful set of plans and maybe multiple measures that are dealing with them in a comprehensive way. And so, having those conversations that you're describing, I think is the most important element.
Rick.
So I'm really curious, of the 660 voters that you polled, when you look at it between the managed flood district versus general Multnomah County, were there significant differences in either the messaging that resonated or their concerns?
As a general principle, no, but the managed floodplain is a really small area of the county as a whole. And it is also disproportionately non-residential. And that's the thing. So there's a lot of properties there. There's a lot of land. There's a lot of buildings, but there aren't as many voters who live there. So it is a relatively small slice, and it's harder for us to, sort of identify places where there may be some divergence. Obviously, because of that, when you're communicating with local property owners there, a lot of them aren't people who are going to be registered voters, but who obviously have a huge stake in the nature of the infrastructure you're preparing for. And so the things that will motivate them, the interests they will have, will be different than the voting population in further afield areas of the county who obviously are still going to get a vote.
Thank you.
I want to highlight that message there. There's been sort of two trends that I've been seeing as we've been talking about this. One thing is, just because it polls well doesn't mean that it's going to change the shape of our work. It may just change the shape of how we talk about our work. I think the second thing is the folks who live in the managed floodplain, the people who own businesses in the managed floodplain are always going to be our core constituency because they're the people that we serve and protect. Obviously, there's a huge benefit to the rest of the district, and that's why the legislature gave us this broader boundary. But when it comes to sort of our general communication and building support for ballot measures and talking about the need for more revenue, that messaging may look different than the messaging when we're having individual, we're at a local neighborhood association talking about, certification and accreditation, and that there's a different need. And so I just want to make sure, especially for folks who are residents of the managed floodplain, as you see our messaging shifting, this is about building out broader support. It doesn't mean that we are going to care or think any less about you all because you're still our core service base and constituency. Any other questions, comments before we move on?
And we will send you these slides, by the way. This was our first chance seeing them too, because the data is really fresh.
I say good news. I'm Really pleased to see the results.
One last question for you, David. You didn't test any negative messages really here. Would this kind of support does that strike you as being in fairly safe territory, or how do we gauge that, given the fact there may be some negative campaigns in the next election cycle?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Bob. We did not test negative messaging in this poll. It is something that we'll want to do down the road. My general sense is, you'll remember that that metric of the people who said they strongly supported the bond measure that started at 23 and went to 40. When we started 23, there's some significant vulnerability to an opposition campaign there. If most of our supporters are people who say they're somewhat supportive, if they're hearing criticisms that you can't trust this new flood control district, that it's too expensive, that there's other things that are more important right now, those voters are the kinds that might be vulnerable to changing their mind. But once they've been educated as to the flood risks, the benefits of making these investments now, and we see that strong support go up to 40%, they become much less vulnerable to that kind of messaging. So I think the way I would answer the question is to say, if we do our jobs in educating the public about why this is being done, what the needs are, and why this is a reasonable approach from a non-advocacy perspective, what public agencies are allowed to do, just describing your work. And then obviously down the line, if there were if a measure is on the ballot and a private, yes campaign is formed, if collectively those efforts educate the public, then I'm much less concerned about the potential impact of opposition messages. But from where we're starting today, with such low recognition of the flood risk, an opposition campaign in the absence of that education could be much more impactful.
Excellent. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Dave. Such informative data. It's just, I'm sure all of us have a lot of questions and just kind of thoughts that we can either email or bring at a future meeting. But thank you very much. Ready? It sounds like we're ready to move on to the next agenda item, which is revenue and program process presentation by Colin. Colin, are you set to go? Colin.
I think you guys want me to kick this off, actually.
Sure, Sarah.
Or did Colin have a statement first?
No statement. I just had a name on the agenda, but yeah, this is Sarah and Jim's presentation. So please give an introduction. Thank you.
Sure, I'll pull my screen up here too. I'm going to reintroduce myself because some of you know me from previous meetings, but you've got a couple of new members since last time I talked with you in any depth. Can everybody see the nice watery slide there? Make sure you're not looking at my email instead. Okay. I'm Sarah O'Brien. I'm Executive Director of Alignment Partnership. I am part of the consulting team led by Echo Northwest that has been helping the new district evolve a revenue strategy, or like the bits and pieces and sort of puzzle pieces to put together a revenue strategy that you all will be considering over the next several months here. And I've also been sitting with the staff in some of their internal meetings with the consulting team and some of their mixed meetings, and just kind of helping be the process and facilitation design guru that helps you figure out how to get those puzzle pieces put together on the timelines that we've shared with you all in the past, and gets you ready to make some of the fairly complex and maybe even a little bit contentious decisions that this board has in front of you in terms of the new district transition here. My goal here, and I'll present a little bit of content that the staff team and the consulting team have worked on together, and then Jim will talk quite a bit towards the center about where we think we're at here. My goal is to take maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes of your time here at the end of the meeting to get you ready for the next few meetings. So we have been focused with the consulting team. You've had a lot going on. You've had an equity strategy. You guys work really hard in your meetings, by the way. I'm always kind of impressed. You've had an equity strategy and a number of other conversations, as well as regular business over the last couple of months. The revenue team from Echo Northwest has been working alongside that with modeling results and sort of pulling their pieces together. The staff are working on a number of different pieces of this. and wanted to have a focused conversation with you all over the next several months here about the details of kind of high-level understanding of the district's programming, the work that you'll actually do, so that when the ECHO team comes back later this fall to talk to you about an ability to pay through for the work, the services of the district going forward, under some of the different mechanisms that you all have contemplated, that you'll know what you're paying for and what our communities will be paying for and what the services are this district anticipates providing, and we'll have a shared understanding of that. So getting you ready for a couple of months here of more sort of programming rather than revenue focused conversations. Wanted to do a little bit of orientation and do kind of a, you are here in this decision process, and help you see kind of what's both behind you and what's coming up next. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes here. Jim's going to talk, and then if you all can hold your questions and comments for the end, unless there's quick clarification, then we'll try to move this through fairly quickly and make sure there's time for discussion at the end. So we'll just try to sort of orient you to what's going on, both internal and external to the organization here, and what comes next, and what the staff will need from you to navigate through the next couple of months of work here. Some of you may remember this kind of roadmap type feeling thing from some previous conversations we had around revenue. There's a lot of detail here where we will share these slides like the others after the meeting to make sure folks have a chance to take a closer look at this. We're down here in between fall 22 and no, this is 2022. We're down here in fall 2022 working on the different parts of revenue structure. And one of the reasons I wanted to call this up and the staff wanted to give you another look at this is just to remind you that it is a long path ahead of us, that you will have a decision coming up in spring of 2023, we hope here, that's pretty complex to sort of sit down and look at a revenue strategy and think about whether to approve it and how you want that to be shaped. And that really lays the groundwork for dissolution of the legacy drainage districts and that dissolution process and the formal sort of launch of the new district going forward. Part of what we wanted to remind you is, although we're giving kind of a first toe dip into program conversations over the summer, most of that sort of strategic planning and detailed program delivery, planning and delivery type stuff will come after dissolution. That's the job of the longer term board, the elected and appointed board that will come to really dig into the details of that program design. But we're kind of in a place here where we have to have enough detail on the programming of the future district to be able to make revenue decisions, to give you good information on cost estimates from the staff's perspective, and to be able to balance a willingness to pay conversation as, you know, sort of relevant to David's conversation with an understanding of what that what that looks like. What are our communities getting from the services this district provides? So we're working towards a spring decision that the staff will ask the board to approve what we've been calling a revenue strategy. And what part of the ECHO team and the staff really wanted you to be aware of and for us to start preparing for even today is that when we ask you to approve that revenue strategy in 2023, it will look much more complex than just dollars and cents and funding sources. So that will include a high-level assessment of what the new district will do, what the benefits and services are that the district will provide and for whom. The part that we focused on most up till now, what will it cost and how will we pay? And also ensuring that benefits and costs are equitable. So we don't want to surprise you with that decision. The staff really, really doesn't want to surprise you with any of those decisions. So we want to start bringing these puzzle pieces in now to make sure that none of the parts of this puzzle are surprising when we get to the point where we ask the board to consider final refinement, finalization, and approval of this. And of course, we have a lot of both board and stakeholder and staff conversations between now and then. So how we think we're going to get to that, how the staff think that we're going to get to that, I don't know how to go backwards. I just won't go backwards. To that full picture revenue strategy involves some iterative work. And I think some folks, both on staff and board and external partners, have been a little, I don't know, frustrated frustrated is probably too hard of a word, but a little flummoxed by this kind of swirling feeling that we get when we're trying to design a new legal entity with a new funding source and a new set of program work. There are three different components that work really iteratively, and it's hard. We have to kind of co-evolve them together in order to be able to figure out how the pieces come together. So as the ECHO team with your guidance has been working on revenue options, we use that to inform, and actually probably all of these arrows should go both directions. Program concepts to have a sense again of what this district is going to deliver to whom and how. That we'll use to help build out cost estimates, but we also need both of those to be affected by the revenue that we think is available and can be gleaned for good purpose and the benefits that will be provided. So it feels sometimes, I think, like a little bit of a circular conversation, and that's why we're not lining you up this set of decisions that goes from first we'll decide revenue, then we'll decide programs, then we'll decide costs. Well, all of those have to be mutually informed by one another. And so what we're going to do is continue to bring you different parts of this picture over the next 9 months or so. The staff will, and sometimes our consulting team will as well, to sort of keep circling around this until we get to a point where we have a pretty good shared solid understanding of these three parts coming together into that full revenue strategy. And that's the point at which we can start talking about one or more specific scenarios that include elements of each of these things, and where we can really start to refine that and get to a point where you all are able to make a decision about it. In order to make that work, again, we want to not surprise you, and so we want to be the staff want to be co-creating this with the board, and so we'll bring you a piece, ask for your feedback, ask for your course corrections, your redirections, and always recognize that the other two parts of whatever we're talking about are going to inform the way that we craft that going forward. And so we'll continue to have this series of conversations of checking stuff with you, going out and talking to external stakeholders, having the best professional judgment of folks on our professional staff and external experts as well, and try to bring you a package that looks really, really, really familiar on all three of these fronts next spring. So all of that, of course, and the staff really wanted to emphasize this, draws from kind of our core documents, our ORS chapter 550 that enabled the creation of the new district and told it basically what to do. The mission, vision, values document that you all developed and passed a few months ago, equity framework, and all of that sort of comes together to inform the way that we're crafting a set of revenue scenarios and what will build into a revenue strategy. And then we've tried to outline a little more detailed roadmap here. Of course, none of this stuff is linear. So just as an example, we work our way through stakeholder feedback, board feedback, come up with a recommended revenue strategy, sort of a preferred alternative that the staff anticipates presenting to you later this year, early next spring. And then at the very end, this last box says, well, we'll figure out how to implement the billing and collection strategy. Well, of course, staff want you to know that they're working on all of these steps at the same time. They're running in parallel. That's really hard to show on a slide. So the staff have this sort of much more complex Gantt chart that we figured you probably don't want to see, at least in the format of a PowerPoint presentation, showing how each of these spread out over time, intersect, and build towards a point where in summer of 2024, you have an entity that has all these basic pieces that's basically ready to launch and shift towards its more permanent form. So what the staff needs from you to be able to do that, and we'll circle back to that figure later in the conversation if folks want a little bit more discussion around it, is kind of help in this transitional role to finish standing up the new district and create the runway that's needed for the future board. So part of your job is to select and implement the ongoing revenue structure. The mandates that are outlined in ORS 550, including, not only the mission areas, but the idea of pulling together a watershed plan, the mandate to pull together a watershed plan, and to have that guide the district's actions going forward. We need to kind of create the space for that on this runway, right? And so part of what the staff really is requesting of you and needs from you to make this work is to help us get the revenue and this kind of super high level program direction and the cost estimates and so forth in place to be able to make that launch happen, be able to presumably refer a successful general obligation bond to voters, and be able to sort of work our way through the steps of that transition that begin to kind of cluster around summer and fall of next year, as we've talked about in the past. So that's what they're asking of you. And Jim, I think you were going to talk a little bit about just how you and the staff have been thinking through how do we get from ORS 550 and our mission, vision, values to the greater level of detail that we need for the revenue strategy. Is that right?
Give it a shot. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, board, for your time and attention today. Just a few reminders to you all that the reason we are here today is because the existing system is inadequate to meet the community's needs. So the legislature and all the stakeholders who worked with the legislature made it really clear to those of us in this meeting that we have to modernize our flood safety system, and we really need to do it soon because people are literally at risk today, and that we need to implement our core flood safety mission in a way that also delivers the broader set of benefits that the legislature created and is asking us for our community. So we have sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity to ask for what we believe as experts we really need to create a flood safety system that actually provides the safety in an equal way across the system, ensures we maintain certification and accreditation, and then also really lives up to the spirit and the letter that the legislature created in the new mandates. And we think there's a lot of ways to implement those new mandates that also benefit flood safety. And so our challenge really is to find a way to work with you all to give us the feedback about how are we going to implement our flood safety work with those other mission areas, and how do we get all of those benefits making the best use out of public resources. And what I've come to realize in working with you all for a year now is that we really need some direction from you. We need you to give us your hopes, your fears, and out of that will come, I think, a better initial set of recommendations from our staff to you. So we have set up a proposal for you to consider that will help you drive this show to its logical conclusion, which is implementing ORS 550 and creating a much more resilient, much more safe, much more equitable system. So we're going to ask you to help us figure it out. And let me tell you a little bit about what I think that's going to look like. Sarah, would you advance the slide, please? Remember, we're working on all three categories of the work required to get us to a revenue structure that's implementable. For the next couple of months through the summer and into the earlier fall, we are going to ask you to focus your time and attention on program concepts. Now, we know really well that we're going to spend the vast majority of our time and energy upgrading and modernizing our existing flood safety system through the PMLS project and the FEMA certification projects. Right? About $175 million is going to go into improving and making more resilient and equitable our flood safety system. At the same time, we also need to flesh out what it's going to look like to do that in a way that meets the other mandates that the legislature created for us, and that we implement those other mandates in a way that also advances our flood safety mission. So for the next few months, we're going to be coming to you regularly with some requests and some educational and opportunities for policy input. Could you change the slide, please? So recognizing in that previous slide that our work is a continuum and all things relate to all things, and at the same time, we also need to create some clear categories so we can have a rational discussion with you all. We have poured over the ORS mandates, we've poured over our existing work, and we've arbitrarily, in some ways, broken it into 5 categories. And so over the next few months, and Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about this, the staff is going to be coming to you with some presentations about each of these areas. And the presentations are going to be designed to solicit your input and feedback and political calculations and sense of right and wrong and all those things that are important for a governing body to do to narrow the range of options that the staff is going to bring to you for your ultimate decision-making around a revenue model. And I really am desperate to go into the specifics here, but I think it's Sarah's job. So rather than stealing her thunder, I'm going to move ahead. But I want to stress one thing before I do that. I sense from the board, I sense from the polling, I sense from the staff, there's some tension about the new mandates in the flood safety. And what we really need from the board through these series of presentations is your direction to solve for that tension for the initial revenue model. The elected board with its appointed members will continue to struggle with that as we go forward. But for that initial purpose of the initial revenue model, we need more direction from you so that when we bring you something this fall or next spring, that it's pretty close to what the collective is willing to support. Okay, so that's our objective, is to really let you guys drive this thing so that when you get that final proposal, it's going to look like something you feel, all of you feel equally uncomfortable with, is probably a more realistic goal for
And
it.
hopefully most of you feel more comfortable with it than not uncomfortable
That's
with
right.
it too.
That's right. But I suspect there will be some who think we should spend more, and I suspect there are some who think we should spend less, right? And so what we're trying to do is tease out from you some direction so that we narrow the boundaries of that and get you closer to being able to make a good decision that we can represent effectively to the public. So Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit more about how we think we can do that?
Sure. So I'll be pretty brief here. We're almost done. So as we walk through over the course of the next couple of months, we'll have presentations from staff and also outside experts on each of these topic areas and sort of general program areas that Jim mentioned. And again, we know they probably should be some kind of Venn diagram, but it would be super complex and we'd spend a lot of time thinking about it. So we maybe can set ourselves the goal of making that Venn diagram before long, but it turns out to be very interrelated.
As a staff, we're working together across departments to figure some of this stuff out. But I do think for purposes of presentation, equity will incorporate it into our flood safety work and all of that. But I also think it's important to break these out to get that guidance that will make the initial preferred alternative or range of alternatives more consistent with the direction that you all are charged with providing. Sorry,
yep.
Sarah.
So no, that's okay. That's a good clarification, Jim. Thanks. So over the next couple of months, we'll work our way through each of these program areas with presentations and discussion. And the way these will be structured, or the way that the staff have been thinking about this so far in doing kind of their first crack at program content and high-level program content and starting to dip into cost estimates, right? It's difficult to come up with reasonable professional cost estimates if we don't know what we're doing. And so that's the process that they have been stepping through, starting sort of working across these four boxes at the bottom of your screen here. So looking at what the drainage districts do today, and of course we know pretty well how to estimate costs associated with that. We know there are existing gaps associated with even the current mission of the legacy districts, things that the staff really want and feel that we need to improve about the way that we manage even the existing flood safety mission of the four districts. A sort of first crack at what would it take to launch with a solid feeling and being able to say with a straight face that we're complying with all of our old and new mandates under ORS 550. And then because you have a very knowledgeable and committed and dedicated staff, they want to spend a lot of time too thinking about this kind of best excelling, meeting community expectations, providing the maximum value that we can for the dollar. What does it look like in each of the mission areas to be able to say, yes, we're doing these best practices in each of these areas, we're meeting them consistently. We know that there will always be constraints on our ability to do that, given revenue potential, given pragmatic constraints, and just even the geography and hydrology of the system that we work within. But what do we think the kind of brilliant version of this future integrated district might look like at kind of the top of our game, perhaps a couple of years after that transition takes place. So each of the presentations will step through for each of these four, give you kind of a high level qualitative picture of what that might look like, some examples, some specific projects that might fit into each of these categories, and then ask for your feedback. So we'll ask you after each of those presentations, what in here really resonates? What's missing? What might we not have thought about that, given the long history that several of you have with the existing districts and with Levy Ready Columbia, what might we be missing that we aren't thinking about? Who else should we be talking to and about what? Because the staff are also planning a series of stakeholder engagements and communications and conversations with different communities, different parts of our communities over the summer. And what else would you like to know or share with the staff to be able to have kind of a back and forth exchange as this content is evolving? So that's the way our next several conversations will work. Jim, did you want to step in?
Yeah, I just I want to highlight that box on the programmatic area called support services, because it may be the first time you all have seen us elevate that issue. And I just want to share with you that there's a whole bunch of people who work for the district who help the program staff get their work done. So it's our finance team, our procurement team, our legal team, our HR folks, all the administration and so on. And what we know is there's a huge impact on those folks. And so we are also going to be talking about what is required, what are the expectations for, you know, billing customer service, for payment of invoices, for legal review. So there's, again, we know what we do today. We know there's some gaps in some of those services, but I guess I just really want to highlight for you that we're also thinking about the work that's required to actually get the work done. We got to buy stuff, we got to hire people, and all those things cost money as well. So we will be really highlighting those needs. And this may be the first time you've had to think about that, but I'm thinking about it every single day. So
Thanks,
thank you,
Jim.
Sarah.
Excellent addition. I will actually take us back quickly to this process diagram, just reflecting that that was a little complex and we may want to revisit it. So just to be clear, we will work our way through this kind of back and forth with you all over the course of the next 9 months or so, and have a lot of time to mull over this with those external conversations, with the internal, with the board and staff conversations, head ourselves towards that revenue strategy document that included everything that we talked about earlier for each of those program areas, including support services, presumably. I guess I should have included this slide. Sorry, when I skip, I get confused. So the next couple of conversations, I'll ask you all for feedback and redirection in just a minute here, but the next couple of conversations, I believe our first conversation will be blood safety and environment, and we'll kind of test out this system and see how it goes. Walking you through that, using the program information that we conclude, kind of the refined version here, to develop cost estimates within the staff team, add that into the model, and then bring it back in the fall with model outputs analyzed by the Echo Northwest team and sort of informed by these initial discussions. Councillor Craddock. I'm going to pull this down so we can see each other. I'm happy to have a little conversation to the extent folks are able to go. I believe we'd scheduled to go a little bit over the 5 o'clock hour. Shirley?
Well, I'll just throw this out. I don't expect a response. So the survey work is focusing on a bond measure, but according to the categories you were just giving us, you're also thinking about operating costs too, and support funds for that. So I assume that we're going to have to break that down, because I'm assuming there's going to be 2 sources of funding that we're going to be approaching. I don't know if we'll approach the voters for both, but that I just want to make sure that we separate that out on how, so we know what we're talking about on each funding option, because the bond measure is, I would say, in some ways this might be more simple. I don't know if any of this will be simple, but it's the other revenue source that the district needs is going to be maybe more challenging. So I'll stop there. I recognize it's close to the closing time, but I just want to make sure that that's clear to all of us on what when we're talking about funding, what we're going to be focusing on in that particular discussion.
Yes, our goal is to avoid going to the voters with the operating revenue model. If we can, that would be the objective. Unless you guys decide you want to refer it, which would, of course, would be your choice.
Councillor Craddock, you raised a really important issue, and I think we as staff and our consultant team need to be really clear when we're talking to you about which revenue option. This was all about the operating revenue and the process to get to the operating revenue. You're 100% correct. We think that the GO bond process will be easier and shorter, and that we can use some of the information that's gleaned from this process to inform the GO bond, but that process will take us significantly less time. And so in a perfect world, we wouldn't be doing both at the same time, but we're going to try to get a little bit further in this process and then start the GO bond hopefully as we're sort of working towards the conclusion of this process, so that we can separate them a little bit.
Thanks, Evan. Bob has his hand up, and then Ed Washington after that.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the presentation. I was just curious about the decision to put flood safety, climate, and environment all in the same box, especially given that environment and climate seem to have their own processes parallel to the equity process occurring. I worry a little bit that that's really going to become flood safety with climate and environment as an afterthought if they're all sort of plugged together.
Bob, I hope what you'll find, and I'll let staff respond here too, but just kind of from a process perspective, I hope what you'll find, and I think what you'll find is the first box will be flood safety and environment with a strong climate and equity lens. And all of the succeeding boxes will also have a strong climate and equity lens. So we tried a bunch of different ways to slice it that didn't get confusing in one direction or another. And there turned out to be no perfect solution. But Jim, I feel like what I've heard your leadership team and your staff talk about an awful lot is that climate and equity are the lenses that are applied to each of those program areas and need serious consideration at each of those steps. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's the struggle, because we want to make sure we're thinking about those things in every investment, even a pump upgrade, right? But we also want to be able to call it out as a separate program. So we're chopping up a continuum, y'all, and it's kind of hard. So we'll be trying to measure it both as an independent program, but also trying to ensure that we consider how best to incorporate it in all of our regular work as well. So because there's a little bit of tension in that space, we kind of wanted to bring it to you together and hope to get some clear direction about that.
Bob, you've laid the foundation well to hold our feet to the fire now if we don't deliver on that in the July conversations.
Thanks.
Thanks. Ed, I believe it's Ed Washington, right? I have trouble reading your name that way, so I'm going for memory.
Yeah, yes, it is. Just thank you so very much for all of the information that you've shared with us today. And I'm surely not saying this to tell anyone how I think they ought to do their job, but one of the things that really caught my attention when you said that it was the last slide with all the boxes and things that we're going to be working on. And one of the first, I think the first box was what does the drainage district do today? And that really got my attention. I think, in looking at everything that we're talking about doing, what the drainage district does today, for me, should be the opener for everything. Because we need to introduce this district to a lot of other people other than those who are directly in the district and those of us who are working on it. So I'm not criticizing you, but I just like the fact that let folks know what we're doing today. And I think sometimes it's a little bit easier to get them to follow if they know what you're all about. Okay.
We'll lean on that structure and see if it works for you all. I see the staff nodding a lot as well and other board members. And I think one of the things that we had played around with and starting to design external stakeholder engagement as well is if we can walk through this with you guys and see whether it floats in just about the way that you've described, then we'll have a better idea how to talk with external stakeholders as well and make sure we're structuring these conversations in ways that make sense to a diversity of communities. So that's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. James and then Mary Helen.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Great presentation. I like how you've clarified the road ahead for us. Two quick comments. I don't think I need a response, but one thing to think about. So in my day job, I work in asset management for a ratepayer funded utility, and we're having very challenging conversations about which assets need the most investment, and the framing of that is what is the consequence of failure, because we can't fix everything. And so as we talk about this district in our programs, we're going to have to, I think, come together on the difference, understanding risk and differentiating between acceptable risk and absolutely unacceptable risk. That's going to be important. That's my first point. My second point is we look at, and I agree, starting with existing services is the key entree into all of this. As we move to gaps, one thing that I have in mind is understanding, is investing in my own education about what best practices are that we are not observing now. And I'll give an example of that. For Penn 1, we were the only district of the 4 districts that did not have a drainage master plan. We couldn't afford it. And so we went out and got external funding from City of Portland to pay for it. And that understanding that the Corps of Engineers does not require, but considers a drainage master plan to look at asset management, drainage efficiency, and for us, water quality and habitat, kind of to integrate Bob's point about what we need to do in this new district. It was important to close the gap by selling it as a best practice and then finding additional resources to cover it. So again, just looking for improvements in my own education from the staff on where the gap is really tied to a missing best practice somewhere else. Thank you.
James, I think the staff are already working on presentations for July that will really fit the bill for you there. Mary Helen?
I totally agree with Ed and James about we need to make it clear of what we do. And I'm going to reference, because Evan's probably the only one in all of this that remembers, about 4 or 5 years ago, you went to a citywide land use meeting, all the land use chairs of all the neighborhood associations. And I will bet there was only one person besides myself that knew what a drainage district was. So we need to be able to explain what we do so that people know the value of what we do. One of the comments I've heard recently is we aren't going to flood. We haven't flooded in 100 years or 72 years. And I think because the drainage districts have done such a good job, people don't understand the fear. And then the 2 neighbors that we were talking in the street, one of them said, well, I don't want them to scare me to death because I'm not going to pay if they just say things that are going to scare me. And I can see that coming. I mean, so my suggestion is we are all in the weeds and understand pretty much, even I don't understand, but if we can involve in these conversations, people that might not understand, and I can point to neighborhood board people that don't even know that they live in Penn 2 or what Penn 2 means or what drainage district means. Drains to them are the things in the street where the water goes. So I'd just like to suggest that in these discussions that we include people that not necessarily that have both learned, lived, and no experience in what they're going to get for what they pay or what needs to be done.
We're running up against our time, so let's hear from Eric and then look to wrap things up.
As we start to look at this process, one of the things that's going to be very important for us is to look at comparable organizations and find out for other levy systems, what do they spend money on, how much money do they spend, and how do we go about putting some parameters around what these programs could or should be. In doing that, having best practices is going to be an important guide to it. But we also need to avoid the problem of the National Christmas Tree Bill, where unbounded by some financial constraints, all 535 legislators add this tiny little ornament onto the Christmas tree bill, and it becomes billions of dollars. And we know that we can't afford that. So what we should do is have a mechanism in place that allows us in this iterative process to check to see where we are in what that mid-range spend is, the lower range spend, and an upper range spend, so that we don't get to the end of it and set expectations for the staff that they'll be able to hire an additional 3 cultural interpreters when we can't afford it. So I would ask that we do something along that line, even if it meant having the budget committee or the finance committee take a specialized role in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. So I think I hear two separate requests or related requests for staff there real quick before I pass it back to you, Steve. One is like skip the gold-plated levies part, and the other is bring us enough in information and perspectives on comparable districts that we have a sense that, you know, exactly what is best practice for folks like us and not just what's the best practice in the universe going forward. And to have the board and subsets of the board able to provide the expertise that you all bring to those conversations as well. So Evan, you're stealing the show over there. I think we better let Steve wrap us up here. Unless Jim, you wanted the last word. I saw
Oh,
you
just real
unmute.
quick, I'm on the executive committee of the board of the National Association of Flood and Stormwater Management Agencies, and they're all looking to us for best practices. So I just want to share that with you. We're all underfunded, but I do think it's really important for us to bring in some of our peers so that you can see what other people are doing. And I really appreciate that guidance. Thank you.
We can share that. Well, thank you all. Before I pass back to Steve, actually, I do want to mention staff asked me to invite you to share additional feedback in future meetings, but also between future meetings. If you think this through and think you might need different information or different perspectives to make it through the process we just described, feel free to reach out offline and flag us down either for an email or an in-person or virtual conversation. The staff are really interested to hear from you, whether we're framing this up in a way that's going to work for you going forward. So please do keep feedback coming.
I want to make one short thing. Hey, Jim, charge them consultant fees for what we tell them.
Yeah, they'll charge us back. That's the problem. We could try. And I just want you to know, this is going to be iterative, right? So your feedback's going to change how it goes. We're going to learn things along the way that might cause us to think differently. So I reserve the right to get smarter based on your direction and feedback and feedback from the public and other stakeholders. And I appreciate your patience as we try and work with all these moving parts to bring you something that works.
Steve, sorry to run you over there. We'll hand it back.
Excellent. This is great discussion, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot more on this topic at subsequent meetings. But is there anything else good of the order before we look to adjourn?
A question, there had been conversation about shifting around meeting dates, and so I'm just wondering, could somebody clarify when are we meeting in July?
So I'll jump in and answer that. So we'll keep our regular, let me just check the calendar, July 6th working session and July 18th board meeting. And at that meeting on the 18th, staff will bring back a proposed bylaws amendment that would allow you to shift to the third Thursday of every month from 3 to 5 p.m. So you'll keep your, and I haven't had a chance to discuss with staff or board whether you'd want to start the new meeting time in August or September.
And we may need help from you all turning people out because we're going to need 3/4 of the board to amend the bylaws.
So new meeting, when you said new meeting time, because there's the
new meeting day. So just for the regular board meeting. So the work session is always on the first Wednesday at 1 p.m. And then what we found consensus to do is move the regular working session of the board from the third Monday, 3 to 5 p.m. to the third Thursday, 3 to 5 p.m. Did that answer your question, Eric?
Yeah. I was in the same boat as Eric. Monday from Thursdays. So.
Yeah, I appreciate the sooner the better because I missed the Monday, the third Monday meetings. I have a standing conflict.
Clear as mud, Eric. Are we clear?
Decision coming in July. And then implementation in August or September. Have a switch from Monday for your regular meeting to Thursday. And we're moving to Thursday so we can get Councillor Craddock and the commissioner from Multnomah County because they have a standing conflict.
So I think it sounds like what would be helpful is even before the bylaws change that we change the calendar meeting invitation and get that on everyone's calendar. So we can move forward and do that for you all.
Question, what are we going to be addressing at the first Wednesday of the month meeting?
Jim?
For July or in general?
Both.
In July, you're going to be working on the equity strategy, and then going forward, it will depend on the pace of the work. But it would be mostly, again, what we're trying to do, we consistently run over length on every meeting. And so we're trying to give you a little bit more time together in a work session and then a decision meeting each month. So the Monday meetings are the work sessions are really discussion, we won't be voting unless you guys decide you want to, and then we'll have more decision meetings. So that's the intent. I think the other piece, there has been a subset of the board that's interested in proposing in-person meetings on an occasional basis. And so that may be part of the conversation that we have with you all in July. We'd like to potentially propose those starting quarterly, maybe this fall.
Thanks. Any other questions? All right, well, we will adjourn. Thanks everybody for your time, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Appreciate you all. Thank you.